My name is Alex Muller. Welcome to Lighting the Way, where we are talking about the recent Lighting Advocacy Letter, the toolkit that's being released today, and how you can take action as a designer to transform the world of materials and advocate for more mindful, more sustainable lighting. I am the VP of Communications and Strategy at Mindful Materials, which many people know of as a library of materials that meet a baseline of sustainability, but Mindful Materials, we don't have time to go into all of it, is so much more. And I think that this webinar is a really good example about how it is this cross-functional community and collaboration hub that's bringing together people who want to drive change, such as the authors of the Lighting Advocacy Letter and everybody who's on this webinar today. Another piece of what we're trying to do, of course, is building kind of a common language, a common sense. That is a weird thing that's happening on my computer. We might need to switch. I'll keep going. What we're trying to do is really align momentum in the building materials industry. A lot of what's happening in the industry right now is that everybody's talking different languages of materials. Somebody says, I want net zero. The other person says, I'm looking for net positive carbon. And we're all kind of talking past each other. And so what Mindful Materials is really trying to do is be this magnet, this convener for all of the experts and industry definitions and all of the standards and certifications and associations that are out there, bring them together, align them, and get people moving in the same direction. And one of the ways we've been trying to support that is through these materials pledges that have been coming out over the last few years, starting with the AIA Materials Pledge, pointing to these 5 buckets of health and sustainability that can drive better materials by saying, we commit to purchasing these, we commit to using them. Manufacturers commit to those same buckets in terms of manufacturing products that meet those buckets of health. And as each one has come out, it really reinforces this message. And so it's been really exciting to work on the Lighting Advocacy Letter. I had no idea when a bunch of lighting specifiers and designers came to us and said, we want our own letter, we want our own pledge, we want to build this, that it would be, first of all, something that would drive hundreds of people to a webinar to learn about this, and really meets a need that kind of goes beyond the AIA Materials Pledge to get into the specificity of what lighting designers need to understand how they can take action in both looking for lighting and manufacturers to produce them. So as I said, we're trying to align everyone around these common definitions. We're building a framework for what it actually means to achieve human health, social health and equity, circularity, ecosystem health, et cetera. Because when we can start to do that, when we can get everyone to sign on to these letters, when we can build this common definition, we all start to move in the same direction, resulting in what I see as transformational momentum. So thanks to everybody who came here, who's curious about what's next. Don't be overwhelmed if this is like your first foray into materials. We know it's complicated. That's why we're all here, to help distill it and make it easier. So I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. We have 3 speakers and then a couple other panelists who are helping on the chat and Q&A. So Melissa Mattis is a senior lighting designer and a sustainability specialist for Sladen Feinstein Integrated Lighting, which is a Boston-based lighting design firm. She's been working with them for 7 years, since 2015, and has taught lighting design for the RISD CE program. She also currently co-chairs the IAS Sustainable Lighting Committee with one of her co-presenters today, who is Alexandra Gadawski. Alexandra is an associate and sustainability leader at HMFH Architects. She has over 10 years of experience designing spaces that center around occupant well-being. Her passion for sustainability and community involvement also intersects with her work as co-chair of the Mindful Materials A&D Engagement Working Group, which we are very blessed to have her on. And then finally, Sarah Schonauer is the Vice President of Education and Engagement at Light where she's helping to lead a team of lighting enthusiasts and really tell empowered stories about light. So prior to Light she founded and led the Canon Design Lighting Studio, and she currently sits on the board of the DLF-NE and the Boston IES Board of Directors and is the executive co-chair of NACLIC. So very competent hands that you are in today for this discussion. And there's a lot to talk about. So I will hand it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Alex. So for our agenda today, we're going to kick off with a brief introduction touching on the why that this conversation, why it's so important, why we're here today, and then how we've evolved to this point in the lighting industry. Next, we'll review the 5 buckets of the AIA Materials Pledge as a framework for thinking about sustainable lighting goals. And then we'll introduce you the toolkit that the authors of the Lighting Advocacy Letter have put together for the signatories to walk through these tangible ways of implementing the public commitment that they've made. And then we'll wrap up with a call to action and some additional resources, and then roll into Q&A. So why is this conversation so important? Well, it's really because each of these commitments that you've made matter. Because when we set our Paris Climate Agreement goals, we were living in a world that was headed towards a 3.6 degree increase. Now we're living in a world that's heading towards a 2.8 degree increase. It's significant change, but not enough. And if you take all of the commitments that countries and companies have made towards net zero and actually fully implemented them, that would get us to 1.9 degrees, not 1.5, but close. A 1.9 degree world is still subject to catastrophic weather from global warming effects. So we still need to do more, but we are moving in the right direction. The WRI named the big question of 2022 to be, will we be able to turn our commitments into real world action? And your participation here today is a part of that global effort. So you can feel really proud about that. So how has this conversation evolved? So today we're focused on the lighting industry, but really the inspiration started from the larger built environment industry. And we believe this is a model of change and evolution that can be adopted to other niche industries as well. Back in 2012, a series of individual architectural firms from the A&D community wrote letters to manufacturers of all sorts asking for transparency around building products. And so then these manufacturers were starting to get a lot of pressure from the design community, which eventually over time caused something really amazing to happen in 2018. The outreach from the A&D community inspired the manufacturers to come together in their own community to figure out a way to collectively evolve the materials economy through transparency around supply chain innovation and awareness to meet the needs of the A&D community. And because they realized as individual manufacturers, they can only really do so much. And so it was their collective cooperation that had power. So a pioneering group of 50 manufacturers founded the LP50, or the Living Products 50, in response to the A&D outreach. And then a year later, the AIA Material Pledge launched, which now has over 90 firms signed on to that commitment. And then last year, we launched the Lighting Advocacy Letter, which was directly inspired by the LP50 letter and the Materials Pledge. And this letter, which many of you here have signed today, is the collective voice of lighting specifiers and ask lighting manufacturers for more transparency around their products. So if we can zoom in for just a minute on the last 2 years in a bit more detail, we see in September of 2020, you can go to the next slide, that Sladen and Feinstein wrote a letter to their office, or from our office, to lighting manufacturers stating their interest in making more informed specification choices in support of sustainable design and manufacturing practices. And along with the letter, we attached a 10-minute survey to collect back information from the manufacturers on what their current levels of knowledge and understanding were around the labels and certifications that are available for lighting products on the market today. And we also collected data on each company's 5-year projections on product development related to material transparency and climate impact, so that we would have a better sense of who is prioritizing these values looking forward. So a year ago, we invited all of the lighting manufacturers that we wrote to a webinar where we shared the results of our survey with the larger lighting community. And we were completely blown away by the enthusiasm and engagement and participation in the webinar. It was really, really astounding. And so we decided to publish the results of the survey, which LDNA picked up as their cover story in the October 2021 issue. And this is the first time the IES is engaged in an article around material transparency and lighting. And so that in and of itself spurred a whole new wave of industry buzz and awareness. So it's really just been in the last year that we've seen a significant increase in the number of luminaires on the market in material ingredient reporting, which has really been very encouraging. And so with this continued momentum of normalizing this level of disclosure around luminaires, our long-term goal for lighting is to be a part of whole building lifecycle assessments by mid-2024. So we have a long ways to go to get there, and that's where the power of this evening's gathering really comes to play. So if you haven't already seen it, this is the Lighting Advocacy Letter. It's hosted on mindfulmaterials.com under the Materials Initiative tab. As of today, we're just shy of 70 firms having signed the letter since we launched it in July of last year. So we actually aren't really that far behind the AIA Materials Pledge, which has 90 signatories and has gained a tremendous momentum of its own. So it really shows how impressive all of you here today really are. And this is just the starting point of our conversation for this collective action. So where we go from here is what's really important. And I'm going to pass it over to Alexandra.
Thank you. So as Melissa mentioned, the Lighting Advocacy Letter was inspired by the AIA Materials Pledge and focuses on the same 5 buckets. We think this is a really important way to gain momentum because when we align between this, well, we have alignment between disciplines, we amplify our impact, and this allows us to achieve bigger sustainability outcomes than we would otherwise. We can achieve so much when we collaborate, and we're so excited to see so many people here rallying behind these shared objectives. So for many years, the conversation around lighting and sustainability has really heavily focused on energy use. And we made a big leap forward with LED technology, but there's still so many other impacts to consider. Today, we really want to think about expanding that conversation, and we're going to use the 5 buckets set out in the AIA Material Pledge as our guide. We want to discuss how human health, climate health, ecosystem health, the circular economy, and social health and equity can be applied when thinking about product selection and lighting design. We're going to start by talking about human health. So when we think about protecting human health, we want to prefer products that support and foster life throughout their life cycles and seek to eliminate the use of substances that are hazardous to people. When it comes to lighting, this could mean requiring a declare label or a health product declaration, or seeking out products that are PVC free. Human health is completely foundational to the work that we do as designers. And now that we've talked about how we were defining this, I'd like to turn it over to Margie to share a personal story about why this topic is so deeply important.
Hi, everyone. Everyone knows someone who has had cancer, perhaps a family member or a close friend, or even ourselves. Cancer is ubiquitous. I believe it is caused from many factors, including genetics, lifestyle choices, and exposure. My motivation to research, practice, advocate, and educate about environmental design is personal. My dad passed at the young age of 59 from lung cancer, which they attributed to exposure to asbestos, an insulating material which was used decades ago before being banned in 1989 as a known carcinogen. My mom is a breast cancer survivor at age 94, and so am I. I believe as designers of spaces and designers of lighting, it is our responsibility to select and recommend products that are proven safe and protect human health. It does not happen overnight, and 30 years ago, there were few resources and third-party certifications, let alone databases like Mindful Materials, to reference. We have come a long way, and there is still a lot of work to be done, but together, we can make a difference to eradicate cancer and other diseases by choosing more sustainable products. Thank you.
Thank you, Margie. Next, we want to consider climate health. When we're thinking about that, we want to prefer products that have a lower embodied carbon. When we're looking at product options for lighting, you could perhaps look at the percentage of recycled content. For example, recycled aluminum could be on average 95% less carbon intensive than a virgin product. You can also ask for environmental product declarations. We can support ecosystem health by preferring products which sustain and regenerate natural air, water, and biological cycles of life through thoughtful supply chain management and restorative company practices. One way we can do this is to ask for products, for example, that have lower volatile organic compounds. When thinking about lighting, we might want to consider the paints and coatings that are applied to our product and the impacts that would have during manufacturing. We can support social health and equity by preferring products from manufacturers who secure human rights in their operations and supply chains and provide positive impacts for their workers and the communities where they're operating. One way to get information on company practices could be asking for a JUST label, which reports on diversity, inclusion, equity, employee benefits, employee health, and the supply chain. Lastly, we'd like you to consider the circular economy by preferring products that are designed for long life and with end of life solutions in mind and enable a closed loop manufacturing cycle. When looking at lighting products, you can get information from a cradle to cradle certification, for example. You can also ask your manufacturer or a product rep for information on how the product can be recycled, reused, or updated at the end of its useful life. Signing on to the Lighting Advocacy Letter was a first step and a really important one, but today we want to talk about how you can implement these goals on your projects. We know that there are a number of people on the call with different professional backgrounds and different levels of knowledge around sustainability. So we're going to start by giving some background on a few standards you might hear about when you're looking at material transparency. For some people, this might be your first time hearing about these standards. For others, you might be very familiar with them, but have not yet applied them to lighting, and others might be deeply engaged in this work and apply it to all of their designs. We want to start with this framework, though, so that no matter where you are, when we come together in the following design discussions, we're going to be on the same page. At the end of our presentation, we want everyone to have the information they need to feel empowered to ask questions about material transparency, and for you to be really excited to take this knowledge back to your firm and share it with your colleagues and apply it on your projects. We're going to be sharing a lot of information today about how you can incorporate the goals from Lighting Advocacy Letter. We just want to let you know that we're also going to be sharing an associated PDF. So that sounds a little information dense. You're going to be getting a summary at the end. I'm going to turn it over to Mel.
Thanks, Alexandra. So we're kicking off the toolbox by reviewing with you what we have identified as the leading labels, declarations, and certifications that are available for lighting products on the market today. We'll start by reviewing the Rawhouse Directive, which is slightly different, and then we're going to look at the Declare Label, Health Product Declarations, and Environmental Product Declarations. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, we do have to just acknowledge that not all labels are created equal, really it's like a variety of different ways. And one of them is about the level of disclosure or granularity that we get into with ingredient disclosure. So the metric that we use for this is parts per million. So in this Twinkie example, a label that provides disclosure at 10,000 parts per million is the same as saying that a Twinkie is made of cake and cream. So it's not really telling us a whole lot. When we get to the level of 1,000 parts per million, it starts to give us a little bit better idea. And then by the time we get to 100 parts per million, it's giving us the full granular disclosure of what's in the product. So some labels will allow you to pick your level of disclosure, and some don't. HPD will allow you to do 1,000 or 100 parts per million, and Declare requires 100 parts per million. So it's just something you want to pay attention to. Another difference in the labels is third-party verification. So not all labels are going to require this. A lot of times it's optional. And so you just want to be aware when you're comparing labels side by side, if they either are both or one isn't verified in this way. But we do recommend that you prefer products with the third-party verified. Okay, so let's take a little bit closer look at Rawhouse. I do want to point out that Rawhouse is a directive, which is slightly different from the other verifications that we're looking at. It's a bit of a lower hanging fruit and less stringent than others, but it's still an excellent place to start when looking for greater material transparency. It originated in the European Union and restricts the use of 10 hazardous materials found in electrical and electronic products. And it's a common connection for luminaires that we think of is lead that's used in soldering small components on circuit boards. Lead is on the red list, and I'll get into the red list here in a few minutes. But I do want to point out quickly that it can be tricky to find the Rawhouse compliance data. When we collected our survey results back from our research, we found that only 30% of manufacturers list this data on their spec sheets. So we highly recommend leaning on your reps to help you collect this information from the manufacturers. And please make the ask that that the manufacturers include this information on their spec sheet so that this won't continue to be challenging in the future. So next we're going to look at declare. So declare looks at a product's materiality and answers 3 simple questions. Where does the product come from? What is it made of? And where does it go at the end of its life? You can think of declare as a nutrition label for building products. Just like we read food labels and make informed decisions about our bodies, we should be able to make the same informed decisions about our buildings and related products. And just like we expect detailed ingredient disclosure in our food, not just cake and cream, the same is true for the level of detail in our products. So while an HPD will allow you to pick your level of disclosure, declare requires the reporting of at least 99% of all intentionally added ingredients to 100 parts per million. So if we take a closer look at the label, you'll see it's broken down into 3 kind of digestible sections. The top portion is the manufacturing information, which lists the life cycle, information on life cycle. You also find the final assembly location, embodied carbon data, and the product's life expectancy and end of life options. The middle section is the ingredient reporting. So this is where we're going to find any toxic materials. So the ingredients that are listed in without restriction are listed in gray. Chemicals that are on the red list appear in dark orange, and the EPA chemicals of concern appear in light orange. And the bottom portion is the Living Building Challenge criteria summary and optional third-party verification. So for declare, it is optional if you want to be third-party verified. And it has 3 levels of designations. The first is declared. The next step up is red list approved. And then the most challenging is the red list free. So similar to an HPD, declared simply means that all of the ingredients have been disclosed. So a declared designation would indicate that the product does contain a red list chemical. The middle designation, red list approved, means that it has a red list chemical, but it relies on an exemption for compliance. And we see a lot of this with lighting. And then red list free designation means that it has 0 red list chemicals in the product. So I'll review the red list next, but the main selling point of the declare label is that it's a very simple way to provide very complex information, yes, to the general public, but also to us as designers. And we know, like, being extremely busy and with our specifying, it's just a love of simple and digestible information. So this label is particularly appropriate for lighting because it has this strong framework for presenting clear, measurable data that fits the complexity of the lighting products. So let's take a few minutes to get into more detail about the red list. The red list is comprised of the worst in class materials and chemicals that are ubiquitous in the built environment. There's 22 red list chemical families, which translates into over 800 individual CSA registry numbers. And the list is largely comprised, you can go to the next slide, it's largely comprised of persistent bioaccumulative toxins, which essentially means that they're synthetic compounds, which nature is not able to process or get rid of very easily, and hence leaves them to accumulate in the food chain, which is bad news for us because we are at the top. The red list is based on the precautionary principle. So, and this is the opposite of the existing status quo. So right now, you have to prove that a chemical is toxic before a ban can be placed on it, whereas the precautionary principle says you have to prove that a chemical is safe before it's allowed to be used, or more simply stated, better safe than sorry. So the chart on the left shows the long delays between identification of a material risk and the regulatory action that is taken to protect people from it. So historically, we've seen that a ban usually takes decades to be put in place. And so the precautionary principle was introduced to avoid these unacceptable long time lapses that result in the negative health impacts, including irreversible health damage, such as pollution diseases. So if we look a little bit more closely at what the red list means for luminaires, there's a couple big ticket items that come up. One is the use of compliant coatings free of BPA, phthalates, and red list ingredients. And the second is avoiding small components that contain polycarbonates. And the third is using wire that is PVC free. So I want to focus on the last one for a second. It's PVC, like what's the big deal, right? It seems so inert and ubiquitous that most people think of it as harmless, but it's actually a known human carcinogen. 75% of all produced PVC is used in construction materials, and in lighting fixtures, it's commonly found in the wire casings. It's both the production and the disposal of PVC that's an issue. And when it's exposed to sufficient heat or combustion, it creates a cancer-causing dioxin. So one of the things that we've begun asking reps who visit our office is if they offer an alternative wiring option that's PVC free. There's probably others, but we're aware of 3 companies that offer PVC and flame retardant free wire insulation. And there's 2 in Massachusetts and 1 in California, but I'm sure that you could find others as well. And now I'm going to pass things off to Sarah to look at HPDs with us.
Thanks, Mel. PVC is going to come up again with HPDs, and Mel's already talked a little bit about these, but they are health product declarations. And in this case, we're talking specifically about human health, right? As opposed to ecosystem, client health, that kind of thing. So what we're looking at here, HPDs are the accepted industry standard for reporting product contents and associated health information. And so you architects and interior designers that are on the call probably already know a lot about HPDs because they're in your world already, but they're just a new thing for us in lighting. We're hoping that after this conversation today, there'll be a few more, right? So if you go to the next slide, here's a high level of HPDs. They are an open standard, not a certification. They are stored publicly, and they are self-prepared by manufacturers who get to choose their level of disclosure, as Mel mentioned. So there is a little bit of this sort of honor system in play here, but it's good to note that HPDs can also be third-party verified, which is, of course, our first choice to get rid of that ambiguity, right? Next slide is, all right, so here's an example, and Mel's right, Declare is lovely and beautiful, and HPDs are a little less sexy, we'll say, but this is one of the only ones that we have right now, so we'll break it down a little bit for you. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing the cover page, and at the top, you can see the level of disclosure, right, that 1,000 or 100 parts per million that we mentioned, the Twinkie example, and at the very bottom, you can see if it's been third-party verified. And then in the middle, where I've blown up that section and dragged it off to the left, you can see that sort of ingredients label and where things like that little villain PVC pops up, right? And other chemicals that are on the green screen list that are similar to what Mel mentioned about the red list and toxic chemicals. So this is where it could pop up and you can see where these things are of concern and start those conversations about where we might change things up. So speaking of conversations, we did have a chance to chat with JLC Tech about their experience going through this. They were lovely and got on a call with us, and it was super encouraging. A couple of the things that we learned were, one, it's not very expensive. It costs about $50 to put together the HPD. And then if it's really tricky, which it can be, there are consultants available to help with the rest of the process. And they said all in, it was only a couple $1,000s. So that's a really nice quiver or arrow in our quiver, I guess, to have to say, it actually doesn't cost that much. We do know some good stories and anecdotes there. So once again, why are we asking for these HPDs? Because they're already accepted and prevalent in other trades, and there's an established process for us to follow. It's not quite as expensive as other things like Declare. It's a little more achievable, and it creates a baseline for us to all talk about and maybe conversate about a little more. For example, JLC told us they didn't find a lot to optimize in their manufacturing process. It happens to be a pretty tiny fixture that they were getting that for anyhow, but their shipping and their packaging was a place where they could really improve. Those baby steps totally count. So that's why we're asking for HPDs. And so I'm going to flip it over to Alexandra, who's going to talk about each EPDs, which are at the next level and where we'd like to be tomorrow with lighting.
Thanks, Sarah. So to finish our in-depth description of labels and declarations, I'm going to talk about environmental product declarations, or EPDs, as you might commonly hear. An EPD is a document that allows you to look at the environmental impact of a product over its full life cycle, starting at the extraction of the raw materials through the use stage and into the end of life. I think it's really important to note that having an EPD does not necessarily mean the product has positive environmental attributes. It simply provides information to allow you to make an informed decision about the environmental impacts of the products that you're selecting. So next, I'm going to talk about the 6 key areas that an EPD covers. So it looks at abiotic depletion, which is the depletion of non-living resources such as fossil fuels, minerals, peat, clay, typically things that are associated with mining. It looks at the acidification potential, which measures the decrease in the pH of rainwater and fog, which can be very damaging to the natural environment. It looks at eutrophication potential, which is linked to an increase in aquatic plant growth, often from things like runoffs from fertilizers or chemicals, which can snuff out existing underwater life. It also looks at global warming potential, which is a measure of heat absorbed by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It covers ozone layer depletion potential, which considers how much damage or denigration a chemical can cause to our ozone layer. And lastly, it looks at photochemical ozone creation potential. These are all a bit of a mouthful for me, sorry. And quantifies the relative scale of VOCs that create ozone at a lower level. So Sarah showed an example of an HPD, and I decided it didn't make sense to show an EPD, as they can vary a little bit in appearance. But I think what's really important for you to understand is that on their cover, they're always going to have information on the impacts in these 6 category areas. I want to just briefly talk about how an EPD is created, because I think this background is important. So you start off by having product category rules, which govern the process. Lighting recently, I want to say within the last 3 or 4 months, has a North American PCR, so that's a fantastic step forward. Then a life cycle assessment, a comprehensive life cycle assessment is done of the full product, and that's sort of the background information, and then this is compiled into an EPD document, which is going to be publicly available. And I just also like to share that there are 3 types of EPDs you might come across. There are industry-wide or generic EPDs, which cover a product type. So say, for example, tile or carpet. This type of EPD is not always, manufacturers who participate in creating these kinds of EPDs will be noted, and the reference PCR will be noted, and there will be third-party verification. A product-specific EPD is done by industries that don't yet have an established PCR, and this type of EPD is not always subject to third-party verification. And the last is a product-specific type 3 EPD, which provides information from one manufacturer on one product. And this will note the reference PCR and will conform to ISO standards. And this type of EPD is always third-party verified. So I'd like to finish by briefly talking about why are we asking for EPDs, because I think this is really important. You might have a project-specific reason, but I think there are some big picture things that we can think about. Without EPDs, we're really limited in our ability to make informed decisions about the environmental impact of the products we're specifying. Melissa mentioned earlier the urgency around climate change targets, and EPDs are crucial to understanding embodied carbon and global warming potential of products. We all want to pick products that meet this criteria, but it can be hard to know which products these are right now. Once we have a larger volume of EPDs available, we're going to be able to start benchmarking both on the product and the building scale. And that's really exciting because we're going to be able to determine, for example, the average global warming potential for a fixture type, and then use this as a point of comparison when choosing products. For example, we're going to know if a product is better or worse than an industry average. We'd also love to be able to be part of whole building life cycle assessment that comprehensively includes lighting and electrical. Right now, when you see an LCA done, it very often does not comprehensively include MEP, and this is limiting our ability to understand the true impact of what we're designing. EPDs would also allow us to create metric-based goals. People often say you can't improve when you're not tracking, and this would help us with that tracking metric and allow us to document our improvement over time. So I just want to share a few quick examples. This will be in the toolkit, but we've talked in depth about 3 labels, and we just want you to know there are a huge number of labels, frameworks, standards, and declarations to consider, and each has value and a place in the conversation. And it's really important to think about how these might relate to your project and your specific goals. So here we're sharing a few examples of frameworks. We've sort of broken this out by the goals category, but there are certainly some overlap, and this is a simplification. I just want to note that CIBC has recently released TM66, which focuses on the circular economy in lighting, and TM65, which has methods for calculating embodied carbon, and these are both great resources. On the next slide, you can see a number of product labels and verifications that you might want to consider when you're looking at lighting products. There's been a massive increase in disclosure over the past year, but there's still more information we would like to see. Declaring, for example, has a huge uptick in products. I believe the last time I looked at the Living Product Challenge, there were some things in process, but nothing available yet. But these are some things you might want to consider. As we mentioned, lighting is often very tied to energy use, but it would be great as you're at the table thinking about design. Are there any other ways that lighting can fit into whole building verification? For example, in material health credits. So just want to have a couple standards you might want to think about. And I mentioned the JUST label, but there are other labels for organizations that you might want to think about depending on your goals that consider topics related to social health and equity. So if you go to the next slide. So we've talked through some examples of possible frameworks, but this is only a portion of what we have available, and this will obviously be very specific to your project. We started off talking about the 5 focus areas of human health, climate health, social health and equity, and the circular economy. And these can be a great framework. And I really love this diagram because it really shows sort of all these gray areas and the layers of overlap between these goals and the associated metrics. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk about what's possible.
Well, I'm going to let everybody take a deep breath because maybe your head's spinning, because I know mine was when we first started talking about all of this. And I want to remind you that we are going to be giving you a toolkit, and this will be recorded so you can come back and listen to it again if we need to talk more. But when we start to look at everything that's out there and then try to have the lens of what we can do in lighting today, we've already mentioned that some parts of the industry from an AEC standpoint are a little bit ahead of us. Lighting is a little behind in some ways, but you can see I didn't put a crawling caterpillar, right? I put a pupa and a chrysalis because we have gotten started, right? But there's still a lot more work that we need to do before we're beautiful, healthy, sustainable butterflies, right? And that work is going to require leadership. And the first step is, of course, us signing and showing up for this. The next step is aligning our path and building that commitment and buy-in, right? And as we all know, sometimes the commitment and the buy-in has to come from the top. And I think I saw it pop up in the chat, clients aren't always the full owner. Sometimes it's the architect. So what we wanted to talk about next is some of those ways that we can get those conversations started and some of the ways we can create buy-in. So if you're familiar with Simon Sinek, then you'll recognize this idea of starting with why, because as humans, why really drives our behaviors. And I think these conversations can feel a little daunting, a little scary and hard, but they're actually maybe a little easier than you might think. And the answers might be hidden in plain sight because the things we're talking about today are actually pretty trendy in terms of what's going on in the world. And there may be a really great way that the client's already asking for this. For example, their mission statement, their defined corporate values, their commitments to sustainability or policies that point towards those might be something that you can build on, maybe even make your client look like a hero by helping them achieve their goals with the things that you're bringing to the table. All right, so you might start asking questions like, does your client have a defined corporate wellness program or goals? Like, jump online and see what they have to say about that. Do they have a corporate sustainability program or a statement or a pledge? Do they have an ESG, an environmental social governance or social health and equity, social justice agenda? Sound trendy to you? That's definitely out there today. Do they have a desire to attract top talent or an interest in employee retention? Who doesn't, right? A laser focus on the bottom line, or maybe it's just that altruistic client that just wants to do better every time, like we all do, right? So now don't get overwhelmed. This is in the toolkit. No one is expecting you to digest this diagram. But what we've tried to do is take each one of those starter conversations and build out a path for you to really start to dig in, right? So for example, does your client have a desire to attract top talent? Well, did you know that efforts to create healthier environments can help building owners and employers increase competitiveness in the workplace? Well, that's true. And here's an article that can help you talk about that. All of these paths really boil down to the same idea, right? The same sort of process. Find the why that's going to resonate with your client, align a strategy around that. And usually that's going to involve coordinating approaches with a larger team. So again, you don't have to do this by yourself. Lighting never happens in a vacuum. That's impossible, right? So use well the standards that exist that already are there to help you build your case. And most importantly, be courageous and just start the conversation. You'll probably be very surprised at who jumps in to support you, right? So one more thing, right? Another flowchart type thing that's in the toolkit is this thing I like to call sort of the timeline of action, if you will. At every stage of the project, you can be doing something to ensure the outcomes, right? In the concept phase, you can be building awareness with the team. You can be setting a goal about what's appropriate for your project. And in just a second, we're going to talk about some things there. You could be having budget conversations, everybody's favorite topic in SD, right? And you can be including strong narrative language. And we're going to share an example of what that can be. In DD, you can be talking with your reps and manufacturers. You can be having preliminary pricing conversations and meetings. You can be choosing which of the labels start to make sense for your project and the timeline that you have. And then you can include, again, language in your Luminaire schedule to try to protect what you're looking for. In CDs, button it all up with your spec, right? You can have a pre-bid meeting with the team to clarify the expectations before they put their bids together, so everybody's on the same page. And then when we move into bidding and construction administration, after you get that first round of submittal reviews, you can sit everybody down, make sure that you understand what the next process is. Let's not waste time. And if you asked for some of these specifications to be including specific information, that's the time we're going to review it. All right, so at every step, there's something to be doing there, right? And I just want to say one more thing before I hand it over to Mel. If you have another idea or a conversation starter or a strategy that works, version 2 of the toolkit's already imminent. We know we need more, so throw it our way. We'll talk about how you can do that. But Mel's now going to talk about some of these phase-specific tools that we've put in the toolkit that you can use to help develop.
Thanks, Sarah. So, right, so one of the tools that's provided for you in the kit is language that you can use in your SD narratives. So right now we're focused around declare labels and HPDs because that's what has current momentum in the marketplace. But eventually for lighting, we want to be included in whole building lifecycle assessments. And so we will need to be able to provide EPDs for the lifecycle assessment studies to for lighting to be a part of that. So because the PCR, or the product category rule for lighting fixtures, was just adopted in the US in November, there isn't a lot of momentum built around this yet. So even though there are pilot programs in place and leading manufacturers are working through this, this is something we'll have to be able to circle back to eventually to include in the narrative. But for now, we're suggesting that you target the top 3 lighting fixtures by quantity on a project to provide a declare label or HPD. And specifically, high quantity specifications often do require 3 equals. So if a manufacturer is listed as an equal, if they don't have a declare label or an HPD to provide, you can ask them to provide documentation disclosing all materials to at least 1,000 parts per million for a given product. So that this will be proof that they're working towards the label and that they are truly an equal. We also suggest the goal of having all light fixtures to comply with the Rawhouse directive, and suggest that you prioritize fixtures that are Rawhouse compliant when they're equally available. So here's an example of how you can capture material ingredient reporting requirements on your fixture schedule. So if a declare label or HPD has been provided, you can list that in your fixture description or remarks. And then for equals that may not have a label, after you've had a conversation with the manufacturer about your desire to list them as an equal and your need for the transparency, and that they've agreed to this with the award of the project, we suggest that at the end of the part number, you add a note that material ingredient reporting is required. And if a manufacturer is obtaining material transparency labels for a project, just ask that they provide the documentation of this label that's in development for proof of equivalency at the time of submittals, since the labeling process can take some time to complete. And then we also suggest that you add a note at the bottom. Sorry, I'm still on the last slide. Suggest that you add a note at the bottom on the material ingredient reporting at the bottom of your schedule as well. So we understand firsthand how challenging it can be to identify products with material ingredient reporting, because we've been trying to do it for the past year and it's not super easy. So our office is engaged with lightaz.com, which is a powerful database focused on architectural lighting. And we're working with them to provide the ability for specifiers to filter search for lighting with material ingredient reporting. Mindful Materials is also part of the conversation, so that these 2 databases will have the ability to talk to one another. And so while this is still currently in development, we encourage you to start working on an internal database for your office in the meantime. So this would be looking at fixture families with material ingredient reporting for your high quantity specs, so that you have a list of your go-to fixtures with this information that can be provided. So like when we're talking about the specs on like the large quantity projects that we spec all day long, like closet strips, under cabinets, 2x4 troffers, these sorts of high quantity fixtures. So this is the approach that we've taken in our office just as a temporary workaround until these more advanced tools become publicly accessible. The next tool we want to offer you are some VE talking points when your sustainable design is on the chopping block. Ren DeCherney with ILFI wrote a fabulous article recently in the Trim Tab magazine on the subject. She offers 3 main strategies based on a lot of great research that designers can use for these discussions with their clients when they come up. So the first strategy offered is to simply do the right thing. And there's 2 talking points behind this strategy. The first is the negative impacts of the construction industry are disproportionately affected communities of color. So it's up to us in the design industry that are creating these spaces that we focus on healthier spaces in order to create a more equitable world. And the second talking point here is for employees, which are our most valuable asset, who are working in green buildings, that these people are really healthier, happier, more productive in these healthier spaces with healthy materials. The second strategy is tapping into fear of missing out. So here, according to McKinsey, sustainability is one of the 9 major shifts in the construction industry. And they say that companies that can adjust their business models stand to benefit handsomely, while others may struggle to survive. The second talking point here is that more than 200 private sector companies have signed the climate pledge, and over 100 over 10 US states have signed onto the Paris Agreement. And I would add in our case that we can point to the Lighting Advocacy Letter to show the commitment and shift towards sustainable lighting as well. So if companies and developers are looking to remain robust and relevant in the future, they would want to consider the full value of their design choices from a triple bottom line perspective, and not just the financial bottom line. And the last strategy she suggests is money, money, money. The first talking point here is that both consumers and shareholders expect companies to be engaged in combating climate change. There was a report that stated that 90% of millennials are willing to pay more for products that are environmentally friendly, and 80% are willing to pay more for products with social sustainability stories. So there is a big marketing shift here with consumers favoring companies that prioritize sustainable practices. The second talking point is that building owners and design professionals may be held legally liable if building occupants get sick because of exposure to materials in the building. So according to the AIA, recent lawsuits and regulatory citations have pinned responsibility on design professionals and building owners who seemingly had nothing to do with the exposure that was caused or could cause a crippling illness. And we know lighting is just one piece of the material story in a space, but it's still important that it's a part of this larger conversation. And then the third talking point here is that green buildings attract talent and can be really charge a lot higher rents. You can see the stats on the screen here. I won't get into the details because we're going to get a little bit short on time. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Alexandra.
Thanks, Melissa. So everyone involved in lighting knows that reps and manufacturers have a big role to play when it comes to providing information on products. So today we want to share with you a couple of questions that you can ask of your rep or your manufacturer. The first one being big picture, what is your stance on material health? And you can dive into the details a little bit further and ask if they offer any products with material transparency documentation, such as a declare label, an HPD, or an EPD, depending on the goals of your project. Once you have that information, it's really valuable to ask if they have any planned offerings for products that meet this criteria. As it's been mentioned before, this is a little bit of a process, and it's great to know what people have in progress. Mel mentioned some of the issues around PVC free, and it's really important to ask if you can get PVC wire casing for your products as a standard, or if there's a potential to do this as a custom modification. When we're thinking about the circular economy, it can be really helpful to ask if they offer any take-back programs for products or information on end-of-life suggestions. It can also be valuable to ask if the product is easily serviceable for replacement parts. For example, is there opportunities to replace LED boards or drivers? Mindful Materials has a great database, and as Mel mentioned, could be linked to LightAZ, so a great way to search. So ask if they have any products that are in the Mindful Materials database. And finally, I think it's really good to ask if they're doing things to improve their process. So we've talked a little bit about you have to start somewhere. So if there's any baby steps towards greater sustainability that they're taking, that's really helpful to know. So we want to very briefly talk about some possible goals. This is obviously very personal, but we wanted to give you a starting point, and then we're going to share some little success stories around these goals. So we want to start off by talking about large volume products. So every project has different methods of leverage, and we want you to think about how you can identify the sort of opportunities associated with what you're working on. We want to talk about transparency in every conversation. And we want to keep asking for documentation for these large volume products, even if we know it's not currently available, so that everyone knows that it's important and it's something that we're really considering. So I'd like you to start by identifying the most commonly used fixture types that your office uses. And as Melissa mentioned, start putting these into a database of products that meet your criteria for sustainability. Because this is going to give you a real place to start from. So on a recent project, I calculated that the two most commonly used products accounted for about 70% of what was specified. So while it might seem like a baby step to be only focusing on one or two things, this has a potential to really move the sustainability needle on your project. So if we think about small projects or perhaps public projects where you have a requirement for 3 equals, given the level of disclosure right now, it could be a little bit difficult to find these equals. So we'd say on something that's small, less than 70,000 square feet, look at your drawings and focus in on your disclosure, on asking for disclosure for the most commonly used products. You know, I know on a public project a year and a half ago, I was not able to find 3 equals with declare labels, and the pace of uptake has been so rapid that I think over the last year and a half, I'm going to be able to do that. So I think that's really positive around how quickly this industry is changing. So on a medium project, so say 70,000 to 200,000 square feet, would suggest you focus in on your 3 most commonly used products. That feels like a really realistic goal when you're looking at material transparency. I'm going to turn it over to Reiko because she has a really great success story to share in this area.
Sure. I'd like to share one of the project that we're working on, or actually we worked on about 6 months ago. So the timeline is actually kind of key to what Alexandra was just saying too, because it's been such a rapid change in the industry. So the project that that I'm gonna introduce was 150,000 square feet of the tenant fit out project, and then that was mainly for the lab and office space. So we were able to have a discussion with the design team and then share our ongoing effort of providing light fixture with a healthy material. So it was really well received from the design team as well as from the ownership. So that really made us, gave us an opportunity to prioritize specifying the light fixtures with declare or the HPD labels. And then, so those are actually easier piece to do that for the smaller fixtures. So like as we found the fixture that had labels and we were able to utilize it. But then we really wanted to keep the focus on the large quantity fixtures. So what we were, and also as we were providing the large fixture specification, we also had a promise to the project that we were providing the multi-names for the competitive pricing. So after reviewing multiple light fixtures and its performance, and we found one manufacturer said they were ready to provide a declare label or the equivalent portion of the documentation. So at that point, that became our card to say other manufacturers who are listed as equals that in order for us to list your products as an equal item, we also need to have the same documentation, either the declare HPD or the equivalent disclose of the material. So that kind of became a really strong card for us to be able to say multiple names with the similar standard. But also we were also sharing the idea with the manufacturer who is going through this as a first time that they don't have to go all the way to the very top level of the certification. They can simply disclose that the ingredients that is used in the luminaire, which gave them some level of comfort that they can do it. But also we told them that you might want to change the material later on because that's not always something that they want to be proud of. So this actually gave not only like us a tool for us to like list those like fixtures on our specification, but also gave them an option to look at their material list holistically so that they can actually make their own choice or the better choice for the later product development. So which I thought was a really nice exchange that we could have.
Thanks so much, Reiko. And then for your large projects, we're going to encourage you to be really ambitious and to have a minimum of 5 products with transparency documentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and share our final call to action to end our webinar.
Alexandra, do you care if I share my short story on that one? Or do you think we have time?
We're just about at the top of the hour. So I'm
okay.
Stick around in the Q&A because we'll stick around, right? The
Yeah.
panelists can stick around for a few minutes and hear Mel's awesome story. All right, in 60 seconds or less, let's get through this call to action. There is some really low-hanging fruit, and many of you have already done it. You know, we're on this journey. We need to get the vans on the road and gassed up, okay? So sign the advocacy letter, and if you have, let people know that you have. Put it on your website, put it on social media, get other people interested. Then sign up for the Mindful Materials newsletter. So when things are happening, you know about it. And when we've got more to share, you're in the loop, right? Number 3, talk about the topic often. When you're at your product demos and your trade shows, when you're at Leducation, when you're at Light Fair, ask about it, see what's out there. Let people know that we're trying to create the signal. Next slide, please. Proactively ask your manufacturers about their positions and strategies. That list that Alexandra walked through, take it with you to your next tabletop and just walk through it with them and ask people to improve. And then we just talked about some goals in terms of targeting large quantity products on your projects, as well as maybe your go-to master luminaire schedule. Try to get those as healthy and sustainable as you can. We can help if you have ideas, let us know too. And last but not least, build your internal database. We live, better or worse, in a capitalistic society. So use your specification and purchasing power, right? And spec green lighted products that meet the criteria. And Alexandra, take us home.
Great. This is going to be shared in the toolkit as well, but if you're interested in this topic, there's lots of great resources out there. So we have a couple that might be useful for you to look into a little further if you're excited about this topic. So as we've mentioned a couple of times, we do have a toolkit here. I believe that we're going to be able to share the link to this in the chat as well as in a follow-up email if you attended the webinar today. So don't worry if you didn't take perfect notes. It's going to be coming to you in a packaged format. And then lastly, we're so excited to see so many firms and people supporting the Lighting Advocacy Letter, and we really want to keep this momentum going so that we hope that you can take the tools we shared tonight and apply them to your project. And we're going to have a follow-up event with you all in 6 months. So we hope we'll see you on October 18th. This is going to be a more informal session focused around breakout rooms where we can have a chance to share all of our successes and our lessons learned. So we hope to see you again in 6 months. Finally, I'm going to turn it over to Reiko and Margie to moderate, but I just want to say thank you. We are so excited and so appreciative of all the support that has rallied behind this initiative. I think we can all say that this has exceeded our expectations. So we're delighted that you're all here and that you're supporting this, and we have such a great group of collaborators.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions that came in the Q&A. So let's go through. So first one is, if the manufacturer can provide the data that either declares its ingredients or the free from the red list ingredients, is that sufficient or the compliance of, is that sufficient for the compliance on the project, or is that a critical that the product is listed? Anyone wants to take that call?
I'm sorry, could you say it one more time?
If the manufacturer can provide the old data that's sufficient for the material ingredients, does that product also have to be listed?
Actually, can I tell my story, because that's exactly about this. So I was actually with the, this was on like a larger size project, and it was a multi-family. It was like around 450 units or so. And instead of, I know we talked about 5, but this was a couple of months back. So we were looking at 2 for the top quantity fixture, which was a downlight and an under cabinet. And we were able to find a declare label for the downlight, but not anything for the under cabinet. So we went back to the manufacturer and asked if they would be able to provide a label for the project. And they came back and said that the price of the material safety data sheets just really wasn't financially feasible for them. And so just wasn't going to work out. But they did tell me how much they cost. And so I went back and I did the math, and I calculated that it was like $4,000 or so to provide the material ingredient reporting. And then I went back and I looked at the job, and it was like a $750,000 order. And so I went back to my rep and I was like, okay, well, like what's going on here? Like, are you sure we can't provide the data sheets? Like the numbers just looked a little bit disproportionate. So we were able to end up like scratching each other's backs in the long run. So the rep went back and explained to the manufacturer how we're like building this internal database of our go-to fixtures. And so like there's a lot of opportunity for potential opportunity for like for the future. And so they did agree to go through the process. So we're accepting the data sheets as compliance. So that definitely is perfectly okay. And in this case, I actually did agree to go through with the HPD process. So it was amazing to be able to lean on my rep for that kind of support and to work through those challenges and those conversations. So I was really grateful for that.
I might just add one other quick point. I used to work on the Declare program at the International Living Future Institute and did a lot of work with manufacturers. And I think one of the reasons to not just say we don't have red list ingredients in there is, first of all, when you make something transparent, when you put it out in the public realm, you want to be really confident around that rather than just saying, yeah, we don't have any red list ingredients in there. In a lot of cases, manufacturers don't know what they don't know. Supply chains are really opaque. It's really hard to figure out what's in there. And so there's a lot of work, a lot of uncovery that happens. When the first Declare labels came out, they probably had a max of 10 ingredients on them. If you look at them now, some of the really good ones, in some cases, have about 100 ingredients in them. The product probably didn't change. I think carpet is a good example of that, but people have learned a lot. And so that's why I think we really push for transparency for using standard disclosures rather than just saying, no, we're good.
Great. Right. Next question. So should the manufacturer state their sustainability metrics via one of these labels? Does this run the risk of harm by admitting, for instance, to the use of the red list materials, even if all their competitors are no better, just ambitious? And without registration that requires certain threshold, how could they know if any investment in improvement, sustainability, and or documentation is warranted by making them more likely to be successful in the crowded market?
I think that's a great question. I'm happy to just jump in on that. I think it was kind of embedded in there already. If we already know it's there, what if we admit it? Well, I think that causes a little introspection already. The PVC one is probably the best thing to point at. We know it's there. I think it's about looking at where your processes might be able to change, right? What could we do? I know Mel dropped into the chat a couple examples of wire casing manufacturers that exist. So if your answer is, oh, I don't know who does it, well, there's an answer there too. So I think the idea is that if you are being transparent, that will actually make you come to the top of the list as, at least in my mind, as a specifier and former specifier, somebody that is more trusted because they're telling us where they're at and where they're headed next.
And I would say too, because the market, like there aren't a lot of options right now, like I'm happy to get any Declare label or any HPD label. So it won't always be like that, but it's like that right now. So I would be happy to get that.
And I think that's the importance too of having these pledges that exist for specifiers, for manufacturers, for contractors, for owners that are out there, because the whole point of those is to create this signal of demand that says, if you do these things, if you act on this, if you put this information out there, we are here to support that. This is how we're making decisions. And I would rather go perhaps for a product that has an HPD 100 parts per million, discloses everything, maybe has PVC in it, rather than somebody who just says, yeah, we're actually good. We don't have PVC, but there's no documentation of that. So everybody really has to come together to support the market. And that's a really important reason that everybody kind of has to be bought into that, and why this education is really important.
I think it's also partially the trust to some companies to actually disclose what's in that product completely. It's pretty scary too, but having that disclosure really makes a good trust of, okay, you are really being honest to the documentation and doing that third party verification and whatnot. I think that really shows that how much we can trust that company too.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question, I actually like this one. In response to a circular economy, are there any take-back programs similar to what Doors Unhinged, I think that's a place, is doing for Doors, that collects and resell used fixtures from projects that tenant office renovations for reuse?
This is kind of interesting because I was just on a call with Mel yesterday. We were talking with a manufacturer who said, we got talking about if you have free sites, for Facebook and things like that, where you can just drive by somebody's house and pick up something that they don't want anymore. Well, we're speaking with somebody from DPR Construction who said that that's an actual thing in the construction world, where they say, they can put up on like a Craigslist of construction, we're not using these things anymore and somebody else can use it. I'm not personally aware of anything like that yet for the lighting industry, but we talked about the need for it. We've got these commercial tenant fit outs that flip every 5 or 10 years. There's nothing wrong with those lights, and they're probably a heck of a lot better than the fluorescent that's in the K-12, elementary school down the street. And so if we could find ways to sort of align those things, recycling is one of the biggest things as an industry we can do, from building adaptive reuse all the way to these kind of more creative ideas. So I can't say that I've got a perfect example to point at, but I do like that people are talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard of one manufacturer in California. I actually can't even remember the name right now. They do have a take back program, but it's not that they have a full circular economy and they're like taking all these parts, but they do reclaim some parts. And I asked them, and they said that they haven't. I don't think they've actually received any fixtures back, but the program does exist. But I was telling Alexandra just earlier this week that there was this design firm, or there is a design firm in Indianapolis, Indiana. They got into actually reclaiming materials from the sites of their clients before they did the demo for the new design. And they created a kind of a circular economy within their own city, where they found a couple other companies that were interested and got free warehousing space and started collecting reclaimed products from their clients, and then worked them into their future designs, which is just like
So
crazy.
cool.
I mean, it's just one firm, but there's people out there that are innovating and like coming up with these like, things, because, you hear about talk of like lighting as a service model. Like, so there like opportunities for us to have circularity in lighting, but right now it's a lot of, still a lot of like talk in early phase.
Okay, so next question is the product declaration. Oops, sorry, just moved around. Product declaration takes resources to be able to provide and maintain over time. Would you pay more for a lighting product that has a declare label versus an equivalent product without?
I'm pointing right at Mel's example of being able to hold a specification because you have that kind of verification that would eventually create the sale. I think that's the value stream that kind of resonates the most with me. In terms of incremental costs, I do think that we can make a case when you're speaking to clients about the long-term value. I think that we have talked enough about life cycle cost analysis in terms of environmental, the whole big picture, that people understand overcoming first cost. But I think if we're talking, wrapping the entire cost of the HPD into your, into the startup fee or something, that's a different story.
I also like to add that that having those competition also makes it more reasonable, accessible for everybody too. So I think having this conversation more and more, demanding the fixture to have the transparency, all make the accessibility of those products more like better access for us. Okay, so the next question is: have any component suppliers been involved in the conversation or commitment, such as Lutron, LED, Osram drivers, with PVC-free options, etc.
I know. I wonder if Ren could answer that question. I don't know if she's still on the call.
Well, we were talking yesterday with two manufacturers that talked about their experiences in getting down to the nitty gritty, AKA the screws and fasteners, and how difficult it can be for something like a screw, which is usually made out of a whole bunch of amalgamated, assembled metals that they don't know what's in it, and they're not going to be able to tell you. And the question was, is that going to be the sticking point? And it really got into talking about supply chain and OEM, because so much goes into a light fixture. And I've had this conversation with many manufacturers. Are you serious? You really want to know everything? And then you have to sort of say, yes, we really do want to know everything, and hope that they'll start also being in the buyer seat and speaking down to their OEM line saying, hey, our customers are asking for this. We need help. You need to show us what's in it, and kind of passing that sort of advocacy down the chain.
It looks like Ren did answer in the chat that she's talking to several manufacturers, but they're not ready to be named.
They don't want to be named.
Still in process.
It's a process.
Just maybe one or two more questions. Is there any conversation going with the federal government or state government to push building code change to request products that requires declare labels?
Lobbyism, I love it. Let's work in the system. Who wants to join that group? We haven't started that focus group yet. We were so busy writing the letter and making the toolkit, but I mean, yeah, that's a great way to make change, right? And I think that's one other way for our voices to be heard.
Okay, last question. It seems that the companies supplying the downlighting are lagging behind. Do you feel that is the truth?
Downlights. Somebody wants to pick on downlights?
They're out there. They're out there with declare labels. There's definitely options.
And if you start Googling, I'm sorry, Mel, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, there's a lot of manufacturers that are willing to be equals, that even though they don't have the label now, they definitely want to be an equal.
Yeah, I was going to say, you start Googling, you'll find more than you thought was out there. I think, again, if we put a stake in the ground now, March 3rd, 2022, what will we have by March 3rd, 2023? Hopefully just these conversations, maybe there'll be more downlight options.
October 18th.
October 18th. Okay. All right. Let's move it up 6 months.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our discussion today. Thanks to everyone who stuck around for the Q&A, which is like always my favorite part, to just kind of get into the nuances. We will see you all ideally on October 18th for our next webinar, where you're coming into the conversation. We're going to do breakouts, talk about successes, places where you fell flat on your face, whatever it is, so we can all learn from each other. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our speakers and for all of their incredible work putting together the toolkit, today's webinar, the letter, and God knows what else they've done in the meantime.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.